Victoria Cafaso's story begins far from the quiet beaches of Tasmania, in a place shaped by the cultural richness and generational rhythms of Italy. Born in 1975 to an Italian father and an Australian mother, Victoria grew up straddling two worlds. Her family resided in the northern Italian region of Piedmont, in a town where the cobblestone streets echoed with centuries of history, and the language of tradition lived side by side with the aspirations of the modern world. Her father, deeply rooted in his Italian heritage, was a figure of discipline and warmth, a man who valued hard work and intellectual curiosity. Her mother, originally from Australia, brought to the household a different energy, an openness to experience, and a sense of quiet resilience that would leave a lasting impression on Victoria. From an early age, Victoria displayed a hunger for life that went beyond the boundaries of the small towns she called home. She was intensely curious and precociously intelligent, often asking questions that lingered in the air long after they were posed. Her parents, recognizing her gifts, nurtured her mind and spirit with books, music, and travel. She spoke multiple languages fluently, easily moving between Italian and English, and later showing interest in French and Spanish. Her academic talents were unmistakable, but it was her moral compass and emotional sensitivity that truly stood out. Teachers and friends remembered her not just as a top student, but as someone who listened deeply, cared intensely, and thought critically about the world and her place in it. By the time Victoria reached her teenage years, she was already thinking globally. She admired figures like Eleanor Roosevelt and Mahatma Gandhi and spoke about wanting to make a meaningful contribution to the world. Her aspirations eventually led her toward the field of law, a profession that married her intellectual rigor with her deeply held belief in justice and human dignity. She enrolled at a prestigious university in Italy to study law and quickly stood out among her peers. Professors praised her articulate arguments, her meticulous research, and her innate sense of fairness. But Victoria was never one to be confined to the abstract. She was equally interested in the lived experiences of people, often volunteering in local programs that assisted immigrants and underprivileged youth. In her second year at university, Victoria made a decision that would ultimately place her in the path of fate. She had always dreamed of traveling to Australia, the land of her mother's birth, not simply to see its iconic landscapes or experience its culture, but to understand the other half of her heritage. Her mother had shared stories of vast beaches, eucalyptus forests, and a way of life that was more relaxed and open than the structured routines of Europe. But Australia was more than a destination for Victoria. It was a journey inward, a way to reconcile the two halves of her identity. With her parents' blessing and encouragement, she decided to take a gap year from her law studies to spend several months in Australia. She arrived in Melbourne in 1995, just 20 years old, full of dreams and excitement. The moment her feet touched Australian soil, something shifted. Friends she met there recalled how enchanted she was with the energy of the place. She adored the casual friendliness of the people, the diversity of cultures, and the raw beauty of the landscape. She immersed herself in everything, visiting museums, hiking along rugged coastlines, and writing long letters to friends back in Italy about the things she saw and the people she met. Her journal, discovered later by investigators and family, was filled with vibrant descriptions and personal reflections that painted a picture of a young woman deeply connected to life and hungry for understanding. In those entries, Victoria often wrote about the emotional complexity of being away from home. While she missed her family deeply, she also felt a kind of freedom that she had never known before. She was growing, not just intellectually but emotionally and spiritually. She had begun talking about doing her legal internship with an international human rights organization after graduation. She wanted to work on issues like refugee rights and the protection of women in vulnerable communities. For her, law was never just a career path. It was a moral obligation to those who had no voice. Her conversations often revolved around politics, philosophy, and ethics, and yet she remained approachable, warm, and deeply human. As her travels continued, Victoria made her way to Tasmania. She was drawn to the island by its isolation, its untouched natural beauty, and its mystery. Tasmania was unlike anywhere else she had seen in Australia. There were fewer people, more wilderness, and a quieter rhythm to life. She had read about the beaches on the east coast, particularly the serenity of places like Beaumaris, and decided she wanted to spend time there before returning to Melbourne. Through her mother's connections and local listings, she arranged to stay with family friends in the small coastal town. It was to be a peaceful stop in an otherwise busy itinerary. She saw it as a chance to write, read, and reflect before continuing her journey. Beaumaris was a place where time seemed to pause. Nestled along the Tasman Highway, it was more a scattering of houses than a town proper. With its uncrowded beaches, windswept dunes, and long stretches of quiet road, it had a meditative quality that appealed to Victoria's introspective nature. She arrived in early October 1995 and settled into a small beach house just a few minutes' walk from the ocean. Locals remembered her as polite, intelligent, and friendly. She made small talk with shopkeepers, helped out with chores around the house where she was staying, and often went for solitary walks along the shore. There was a tranquility about her presence, a peaceful kind of energy that made people feel calm around her. She spent her days reading, sketching, and journaling. She spoke to her mother regularly by phone, telling her how beautiful Tasmania was and how she planned to return to Melbourne soon. She was scheduled to meet up with friends there before eventually flying back to Italy. But she had a few more days in Beaumaris, and she wanted to enjoy them fully. She loved the ocean. It reminded her of summers on the Ligurian coast and gave her a sense of home even when she was far away. On the morning of October 11th, she woke up early and went for a walk along the beach. She was wearing a short-sleeved shirt and shorts, with a beach towel and her sunglasses. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year, and the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and eucalyptus. She was last seen alive around 10:30 a.m. by a few beachgoers who noted her walking near the water, seemingly carefree and absorbed in her surroundings. She looked content, peaceful, and utterly unaware that this would be the last walk she would ever take. What happened after that remains one of Tasmania's most haunting mysteries. But before the headlines, before the tragedy, before the questions and the heartbreak, there was just Victoria, a young woman with a heart full of dreams, a mind sharp with purpose, and a life that was meant to unfold across decades, not be cut short on the sands of a quiet beach. In telling her story, it is vital to remember not just how she died, but how she lived. She was a daughter, a friend, a student, a dreamer, and a bridge between two continents. Her murder sent shockwaves through two countries, but the deeper loss was personal and profound. For those who knew her, and even for those who came to know her only through news stories and police reports, the pain came from understanding all that she could have been. This first chapter in the story of Victoria Cafaso is not just about a victim. It is about a vibrant, gifted young woman whose light shone brightly, however briefly, before it was extinguished on the edge of the Tasman Sea. The morning of October 11th, 1995, began like any other in the coastal town of Beaumaris, a quiet stretch of Tasmania's northeast coastline where the rhythm of life was dictated by the tides, the shifting winds, and the occasional hum of traffic along the Tasman Highway. It was spring in Australia, and the day held the soft promise of warmth. The air was clear and salty, the kind of fresh that fills your lungs and makes you feel present in a way only nature can. For the few dozen residents scattered across the beachside community, it was a day like countless others. But for one young woman, Victoria Cafaso, it was to be the last day of her life. Victoria had been staying with family friends in Beaumaris for several days. The house she was lodging in sat just a few minutes from the shoreline, a modest structure set against the backdrop of the ocean's steady breath. She had spent the previous days walking the beach, writing in her journal, and savoring the quiet. Friends she had spoken to by phone described her as relaxed and happy. She was due to return to Melbourne soon and then back to Italy to resume her law studies, but there was no urgency in her demeanor. She had fallen into the rhythm of the sea, letting its stillness seep into her bones. That morning she rose early. The household stirred with the low murmur of daily routines, breakfast being prepared, showers taken, coffee brewed, but Victoria's focus was on the beach. She dressed in a white short-sleeved shirt and floral shorts, casual and summery, and gathered a few personal items. She tucked a green beach towel under her arm and placed her sunglasses atop her head. She was wearing a swimsuit beneath her clothes, suggesting she intended to swim or at least wade into the cold Tasman Sea. With a small wave and a soft "see you later," she stepped out the front door and into the warming light of the day. It was sometime before 10 a.m. when she set off down the sandy track, leading toward the beach. The path was familiar to her by now, bordered by scrubby bushes and wild grass, occasionally scattered with shells or driftwood thrown up by the ocean. The sound of waves grew louder with each step, a gentle roar in the background of birdsong and breeze. As she walked, she passed by no one. Beaumaris was never crowded, but she was not entirely alone either. Several residents in nearby homes were beginning their day. Some looked out from windows or porches. A few cars passed on the highway. In such a small place, movement rarely went unnoticed. By around 10:15 a.m., Victoria was seen walking along the shoreline by two separate witnesses. One was a local woman walking her dog, the other a couple staying at a nearby holiday house. All three later described her as appearing calm, relaxed, and alone. She walked slowly, at times near the water's edge, at other times closer to the dunes. She seemed to be absorbing the beauty around her, perhaps lost in thought. Her green towel was slung casually over one shoulder, and she carried nothing else apart from the lightness of the day. The dog walker remembered something particular. As Victoria passed her, she smiled. It wasn't a forced or fleeting gesture, but a genuine moment of connection, the kind that sticks with you when you later realize it was the last smile that person would ever give. The woman, in her later statement to police, said she thought Victoria looked content and very present. There was no fear, no apprehension, no sense that anything was wrong. It was just another morning on the beach. By around 10:30 a.m., Victoria had walked farther down the beach, past a cluster of rocks known locally as the Point. This area was more secluded, tucked slightly out of sight from the more commonly walked parts of the shore. The sand there was fine and soft, the kind that kept footprints for hours. It was here, or somewhere very near, that something changed. The peaceful rhythm of her morning, the serenity of the coast, and the innocence of a solo beach walk were shattered by the arrival of someone else, someone with darker intentions. What happened in the next few minutes is a mystery clouded in uncertainty, but the evidence found later would suggest that Victoria was approached, confronted, and ultimately attacked in a sudden, violent assault. There were no signs that she fought back for long. No defensive wounds that would indicate a prolonged struggle. Instead, the attack seemed to come swiftly and with overwhelming force. She was hit in the head multiple times with a blunt object, the blows so severe they caused massive trauma. The attacker then dragged her body a short distance up the beach, attempting to partially bury her beneath seaweed and sand. Her towel was laid out nearby, her sunglasses were missing, and her clothing was disturbed in a way that strongly suggested a sexual motive, though forensic evidence was inconclusive on that point. Victoria's body was discovered later that afternoon by a local man walking his dog. The sun was still high in the sky, casting golden shadows across the sand. At first, he thought he had come across a pile of clothes or a discarded mannequin. It was only when he moved closer that he saw her. The shock of it stopped him in his tracks. A young woman, motionless, battered, lifeless, left out in the open in a place known for tranquility and safety. He rushed back to the nearest house and called police. The entire community was about to be shaken to its core. But before that grim discovery, in the hours between her last sighting and the moment her body was found, a creeping tension had already begun to take root. Two people who had seen Victoria earlier grew uneasy when they passed the same stretch of beach again and saw no sign of her. A few noticed something odd about the way seaweed was piled near the dunes, as if nature had been disturbed. But no one could have imagined what lay beneath. In a place like Beaumaris, violence seemed like an impossibility, and that made the silence even more haunting. The initial police response was swift, but the sense of disbelief was palpable. Nothing like this had ever happened in Beaumaris. Detectives cordoned off the area and began the grim task of collecting evidence. The beach was scanned for footprints, items of clothing, signs of a struggle. Victoria's belongings were found scattered, her towel, part of her clothing, one earring. But her sunglasses and one of her shoes were missing and would never be found. The attacker had taken them, perhaps as trophies, perhaps to conceal evidence. Eyewitness accounts became vital. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been on or near the beach that morning. Several residents recalled seeing a man in his 30s loitering near the area where Victoria was last seen. He was described as scruffy, with a beard and wearing dark clothes. Another witness claimed to have seen a four-wheel-drive vehicle parked awkwardly near the beach track around the same time. But these leads, while tantalizing, led nowhere conclusive. The beach had been open, unmonitored, and easy to access. Anyone could have come and gone in the span of minutes. The attacker had the advantage of surprise and the benefit of time. The broader community was left reeling. News of Victoria's murder spread quickly through Tasmania and eventually across Australia. For many, it was unthinkable. A young woman on a solo walk, attacked and killed in broad daylight, in one of the country's most peaceful regions. Women across the state began questioning their own safety in public spaces. Beaumaris, once a hidden gem of serenity, became a crime scene. Residents locked their doors, looked suspiciously at passing strangers, and mourned the loss of innocence that came with such a brutal act. Victoria's family was devastated. Her parents received the news in Italy, thousands of miles away, and immediately flew to Australia. The weight of their grief was compounded by the distance, the shock, and the unanswered questions. Who could have done this?
Why?
What kind of person commits such a violent act in such a tranquil place and leaves without a trace? In the days that followed, investigators combed through Victoria's personal life, searching for any clues. They found nothing to suggest she was involved in anything risky or secretive. She was simply a traveler, a student on a journey, an innocent soul in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Her final hours were as ordinary as any. A walk on the beach, a few smiles, the gentle crash of waves, and then an act of extraordinary cruelty that no one saw coming. This chapter in Victoria's story ends not with resolution, but with questions. It is a transition from light to darkness, from the promise of a bright future to the cold reality of sudden death. And yet, even here, in the heart of this tragedy, it is vital to remember who she was before that final walk. The day began with sunlight and promise. It ended in shadows. But Victoria's light, her warmth, her passion, her spirit, still lingers, haunting the sands of Beaumaris Beach where she was last seen alive. The discovery of Victoria Cafaso's body on the sands of Beaumaris Beach on the afternoon of October 11, 1995, shattered the calm of the quiet coastal town. A local man walking his dog stumbled upon the horrific sight. A young woman's partially buried body, concealed under seaweed and sand near the dunes. Her clothing was disturbed, her face bore severe injuries, and her body lay twisted unnaturally. The realization of what he had found sent immediate ripples of fear through the small community. He rushed to alert nearby residents, and within minutes, the police were called. Authorities arrived quickly and began cordoning off the area. The scene was grim and disturbing. Victoria's green towel lay spread out a few meters from her body, and items like a sandal and part of her clothing were scattered nearby. One of her earrings was missing, and her sunglasses were nowhere to be found. Police noted that she was found barefoot and half-naked, with signs that her attacker had tried to cover her body. There were no clear drag marks, which indicated the assault likely happened very near to where she was found. Forensic teams descended on the scene. Investigators noted the presence of blunt force trauma to her head, consistent with multiple strikes using a heavy object. Her injuries were devastating, enough to kill her quickly. There were signs that she may have been sexually assaulted, though due to the time spent exposed on the beach and a lack of certain evidence, forensic conclusions were limited. An autopsy confirmed the cause of death as cranial trauma from a violent attack. News of the murder sent shockwaves through Beaumaris. Residents who had seen her walking peacefully that morning were now grappling with the reality that something so brutal had happened in their backyard. Her host family, who had welcomed her just days earlier, were overcome with guilt and sorrow. Locals left flowers at the beach access points, and a memorial took shape within days. Victoria's family in Italy was informed, and their grief was overwhelming. Her parents traveled to Tasmania in disbelief, greeted by a growing media presence and a community in mourning. Their daughter had come to Australia full of dreams and warmth, only to be taken in an act of cruelty no one could comprehend. The police investigation began with urgency, but despite the high-profile nature of the case, it would soon become clear how difficult justice would be to find. The beach was open, the evidence fragile, and the window of opportunity for the killer to disappear had long passed. The brutality of the crime contrasted painfully with the beauty of the place, and Beaumaris would never feel the same again. In the days and weeks following the murder of Victoria Cafaso, the initial hope that a swift arrest might bring justice quickly gave way to a slow, unraveling sense of frustration. From the outset, the police investigation was marred by serious procedural missteps. The crime scene on Beaumaris Beach, open and vulnerable to the elements, had not been immediately secured in a way that preserved all potential evidence. Footprints were trampled, and certain items, possibly critical, were left uncollected. As days passed, tides and time washed away opportunities that would never return. Forensic evidence, already limited due to exposure, was not maximized. Investigators failed to thoroughly canvass the surrounding homes and campers along the beachfront. Witnesses who had seen Victoria that morning were not interviewed in a timely or detailed manner. Some people later claimed they were never spoken to at all. With each misstep, the momentum behind the investigation waned. Suspects or persons of interest were briefly looked into, including locals with troubling pasts or those who were seen on the beach around the same time. But no strong leads were pursued long enough to develop into charges. Rumors circulated about individuals known for violence or odd behavior, yet without hard evidence, the police found themselves circling the same vague possibilities. As weeks turned to months, the community's initial grief morphed into anger and disappointment. People began to speak out, questioning how such a brutal crime could go unsolved in such a small place. The failure to gather and act decisively in the early hours had left investigators fumbling in the dark, and that darkness would only deepen as the trail grew colder. As the years passed without an arrest in Victoria Cafaso's murder, speculation and suspicion began to take root in the quiet streets of Beaumaris. In the absence of answers, theories grew louder, some whispered behind closed doors, others printed in local columns or shared in hushed tones at pub counters. Was the killer someone local, well acquainted with the rhythms of this small coastal town? Or was it a stranger, a traveler passing through who disappeared as quickly as they arrived? Some believed the crime bore similarities to past assaults in the region, raising questions about potential serial offenders. Others pointed to individuals with histories of violence or disturbing behavior who, for reasons unexplained, were never thoroughly investigated. A few brave voices even suggested there had been attempts to downplay leads, hinting at cover-ups or intimidation. Witnesses reportedly felt silenced or ignored. In such a close-knit community, loyalty and fear could sometimes eclipse justice. This lingering sense of secrecy became part of the tragedy itself. Beaumaris remained a place scarred by loss and unresolved tension. With no one charged and no official resolution, the shadows cast by suspicion grew longer with each passing year, and the silenced voices, both Victoria's and those who might hold pieces of the truth, remained unheard. Years after Victoria Cafaso's murder, the fight for justice had not faded, it had only grown more determined. In 2000 and 2001, formal inquests were held, finally giving voice to the questions that had haunted both her family and the broader community. The coroner openly criticized the initial police investigation, highlighting missed opportunities and raising concerns about how the case had been handled from the very beginning. For Victoria's family, especially her mother and sister, These inquests were both a painful reminder of what was lost and a vital step toward accountability. Journalists, legal advocates, and public supporters joined the family's calls for justice, helping to keep Victoria's name in the headlines even as the years slipped by. The case was eventually picked up by Tasmania Police's Cold Case Unit, a signal that hope, however faint, was still alive. Yet, behind every press release and public statement was a deep, unrelenting grief. The psychological toll on her loved ones, who had to live with unanswered questions and unhealed wounds, became part of the long narrative of this case. Despite decades of silence from the justice system, they refused to give up. For them, justice for Victoria was not just a cause, it was a promise. Decades after Victoria Cafaso's life was violently cut short, her case remains unsolved, but not forgotten. In recent years, Tasmania Police's Cold Case Unit has renewed attention on the investigation, using advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, to re-examine old evidence with new eyes. There is hope, but also limitations. Time has worn away memories, and evidence may have degraded. Still, investigators continue to explore every possibility. This final chapter is not only about criminal investigation, it's about memory and purpose. It reflects on who Victoria was, a vibrant young woman with a future full of promise and the deep need to give her story a voice. Her legacy lives on in every effort to find the truth. As long as her story is told, justice is still possible.